The greatest surprises never announce themselves. They simply wait for someone proud enough to overlook them. On a cool autumn afternoon, the golden light of Manhattan reflected across the tall windows of Bellafont, one of the city's most elegant Italian restaurants. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath warm chandeliers while the gentle melody of a grand piano floated quietly through the dining room. Every table carried fresh white roses, polished silverware, and conversations spoken in calm, confident voices. It was the kind of place where success arrived wearing tailored suits instead of expensive smiles. The front door opened, and nearly every employee instinctively glanced toward the entrance. Nicholas Romano stepped inside, carrying himself with the quiet authority that never required an introduction. The white Italian-American billionaire had spent decades building one of the largest international logistics companies in North America, but those who truly knew him understood that his greatest responsibility waited beside him rather than inside any boardroom. 11-year-old Lucas Romano walked at his father's side, wearing a navy blazer and carrying a backpack that still held the homework he planned to finish after lunch. Since losing his wife several years earlier, Nicholas had devoted every spare moment to raising his son, even if business often demanded more of him than he wished to give. The hostess greeted them warmly before leading them toward a quiet table near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. At almost the same moment, another employee stepped forward carrying 2 menus with careful hands. Grace Bennett wore a clean black apron over a crisp white shirt, her light brown hair neatly tied behind her shoulders. She moved with calm confidence, but spoke softly, almost disappearing into the rhythm of the restaurant. Most customers noticed only another waitress. Very few noticed the thoughtful eyes that quietly observed everything around her. "Good afternoon," Grace said with a gentle smile. "Welcome. My name is Grace. I will be taking care of you today." Nicholas nodded politely, without looking up from the message appearing on his phone. Another international meeting had just been delayed because executives in Milan could not reach an agreement. He quietly placed the phone beside his water glass and accepted the menu. Lucas smiled politely toward Grace. "Thank you." She returned the smile before allowing them time to decide. As Grace walked toward another table, Nicholas glanced briefly across the dining room. Every server appeared professional, yet his attention returned to Grace for only a moment. She looked young, quiet, and ordinary. Nothing about her suggested unusual experience. Nothing hinted at hidden ability. Nicholas slowly closed the menu before speaking to his son in fluent Italian. "Let us see whether anyone here truly understands authentic hospitality." Lucas answered in the same language, sounding slightly uncertain. "Dad, maybe they do." Nicholas offered only a faint smile. Most people memorize greetings. Very few understand culture. Neither of them realized Grace had paused only a few feet away while organizing clean glasses at a nearby service station. Her expression never changed. She continued arranging the table exactly as before, never turning toward them and never revealing that every Italian word had reached her ears with complete clarity. Moments later, she returned carrying chilled, sparkling water. Nicholas looked directly at her before asking, once again in fluent Italian, an unusually detailed question about the regional origin of a traditional dish listed on the menu. Around them, the restaurant remained peacefully unaware that a silent test had just begun. Grace met his eyes for only a brief second. Then she gently poured the water into both glasses, thanked them for their patience, and quietly remained silent. Grace Bennett maintained the same calm expression, carefully setting the sparkling water beside Nicholas Romano and his son before stepping back with quiet professionalism. She neither answered the question nor showed the slightest sign that she had understood every Italian word. Nicholas watched her for a moment, almost expecting confusion or an awkward apology. Neither came. She simply offered a courteous smile. "May I give you another minute to decide, sir?" she asked in flawless English. Nicholas nodded once. "Very well." As Grace walked toward another table, Lucas looked at his father with a curious expression. Maybe she did not understand. Nicholas folded the menu with measured confidence. Perhaps, or perhaps she recognized only a few words. Real fluency is much rarer than people believe. Lucas quietly accepted the explanation, although something about Grace's composed demeanor continued to linger in his thoughts. Across the dining room, Grace continued her work exactly as she always did. She welcomed an elderly couple celebrating an anniversary, patiently described gluten-free options to another guest, and remembered the favorite dessert of a regular customer without checking a single note. Every movement appeared natural, practiced through years of serving people with genuine attention rather than routine politeness. The restaurant manager observed her from a distance with quiet appreciation. Grace never created unnecessary attention, yet customers consistently left feeling valued. A few minutes later, she returned to Nicholas's table carrying a small basket of warm artisan bread. "Have you had enough time to decide?" she asked. Nicholas closed the menu and again spoke only in Italian, this time asking an even more detailed question about the traditional preparation of the restaurant's Sicilian seafood stew, mentioning a regional variation rarely known outside southern Italy. Lucas glanced toward Grace, waiting for her reaction. She listened respectfully, her eyes steady and attentive. Then she answered only in English. "The chef prepares it with fresh Atlantic seafood every afternoon. If you enjoy lighter flavors, I would also recommend the grilled sea bass. Both are excellent today." Nicholas remained expressionless. Her answer was perfectly appropriate, yet it completely avoided the language he had intentionally chosen. He quietly ordered the seafood stew while Lucas selected handmade pasta with roasted vegetables. Grace thanked them warmly, repeated every detail accurately, and disappeared toward the kitchen. Nicholas leaned back in his chair. "Professional," he admitted softly, but she still avoided the question. Lucas looked through the large windows toward the busy Manhattan streets before speaking. Maybe she thought it was more polite to answer in English. Nicholas smiled faintly. Possibly. Yet even as he spoke, uncertainty had begun replacing confidence. There had been something unusual about the way Grace listened. She had not looked surprised. She had not hesitated. She had answered immediately, almost as though she had chosen not to reveal something. Meanwhile, inside the kitchen, Grace carefully reviewed each order before handing it to the chef. One younger server approached with a puzzled smile. "That customer near the window keeps speaking Italian. Is he trying to impress someone?" Grace laughed quietly. "Maybe he simply misses home." "Do you understand any of it?" the server asked casually. Grace paused for the briefest moment before placing another plate onto his serving tray. "Enough to know he loves authenticity," she answered gently, revealing nothing more. Moments later, she carried the meals into the dining room with graceful confidence. As she carefully placed each plate before Nicholas and Lucas, a nearby businessman unexpectedly bumped the edge of the service aisle while reaching for his briefcase. Grace instinctively steadied the tray without spilling a single drop or disturbing a single dish. The movement lasted only a second, yet it revealed remarkable composure under pressure. Nicholas noticed. Grace apologized to the nearby guest with sincere kindness, even though the accident had not been her fault. Then she turned back toward Nicholas and Lucas with the same calm smile she had worn since they first arrived. For the first time that afternoon, Nicholas found himself wondering whether the quiet waitress was remaining silent because she could not answer his questions, or because she had already decided that silence was the wiser response. The aroma of fresh herbs and warm bread drifted gently through the dining room as lunch service reached its busiest hour. Conversations blended with the soft piano melody while servers moved gracefully between tables carrying polished silver trays. Nicholas Romano quietly sampled the seafood stew before setting down his spoon. The flavors were balanced, authentic, and surprisingly familiar. He looked toward Lucas, who smiled after tasting his handmade pasta. "This is really good," Lucas said sincerely. Nicholas nodded, although his attention remained fixed on the young waitress moving calmly across the restaurant. Grace Bennett never hurried, yet she somehow reached every table exactly when customers needed her. She anticipated requests before anyone spoke and solved small problems with quiet efficiency. The more Nicholas observed her, the less ordinary she seemed. A few moments later, Grace approached with a fresh basket of warm bread. "How is everything so far?" she asked with the same gentle professionalism. Nicholas looked directly at her before speaking once again in Italian, this time choosing an expression rarely heard outside northern Italy. He commented that the seasoning reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen near Lake Como and asked whether the chef had intentionally followed that regional tradition. His tone remained calm, but beneath the question rested another silent challenge. Grace carefully refilled Lucas's water glass before looking briefly toward Nicholas. For one quiet heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so soft that only their table could hear, Grace answered in flawless Italian. "Not exactly, sir. The chef follows a Sicilian recipe, but he adds a small amount of fresh rosemary near the end instead of during the first simmer. That preserves the fragrance without overpowering the seafood. It is different from the tradition around Lake Como, but it creates a beautiful balance." Time seemed to stop. Nicholas did not move. His hand remained resting beside the spoon, while surprise slowly replaced every assumption he had carried into the restaurant. Lucas's eyes widened with genuine amazement as he looked from Grace to his father. The nearby sounds of the restaurant continued as normal, yet the small space surrounding their table felt completely still. Grace offered only a polite smile, as though nothing unusual had happened. "Would you like freshly grated Parmesan for the pasta?" she asked Lucas, returning naturally to English. "Yes, please," Lucas answered almost automatically, still staring at her in disbelief. Grace carefully grated the cheese, thanked them, and quietly excused herself to assist another table before either of them found the words to respond. Nicholas watched her walk away without saying anything. For the first time in many years, silence felt more honest than conversation. Lucas leaned slightly toward his father. "Dad, she understood everything." Nicholas slowly nodded. "She understood every word from the moment we arrived." Lucas smiled with quiet excitement. "Then why did she wait?" Nicholas looked across the dining room where Grace was patiently helping an elderly couple choose dessert. Because she chose respect over proving herself. The realization settled heavily in his thoughts. He had believed he was testing a waitress. Instead, the waitress had quietly passed a far more important test than the one he had designed. She had listened without embarrassment, responded without pride, and spoken only when kindness required an answer rather than when her own reputation demanded it. Nicholas lowered his eyes toward the table, remembering every assumption he had made during the past hour. None of them had been based on evidence. They had been built entirely upon appearance. Across the restaurant, Grace continued serving guests with the same calm smile she had worn all afternoon, never seeking attention, never waiting for praise, and never behaving differently simply because one customer had finally discovered what she had quietly known all along. In that elegant Manhattan dining room, one whispered sentence had accomplished what no loud argument ever could. It had replaced certainty with humility, curiosity with respect, and judgment with the beginning of genuine understanding. Grace Bennett returned to the quiet rhythm of her work as though nothing remarkable had happened. She greeted new guests with the same gentle smile, thanked each customer sincerely, and moved gracefully through the dining room without allowing the whispered Italian conversation to change her composure. Nicholas Romano watched her from across the room with growing curiosity. He had expected surprise, perhaps even pride after revealing such remarkable fluency. Instead, she behaved exactly as she had before. Lucas noticed the thoughtful expression on his father's face. "Are you still thinking about what she said?" he asked softly. Nicholas nodded. "I am thinking about what she did not say." Lucas looked puzzled. Nicholas continued. "Most people would have answered immediately just to prove they were right. She waited until there was a genuine reason to respond. That tells me more about her character than her language skills." Their lunch continued peacefully, yet Nicholas found himself observing details he had completely overlooked when they first arrived. Grace remembered every customer's preferences without writing anything down. She quietly comforted an elderly guest who seemed anxious about dietary restrictions. She patiently explained ingredients to a young family visiting from another state. Each conversation reflected kindness rather than routine courtesy. She treated every person with equal respect, whether they wore expensive watches or simple jackets. Near the service station, the restaurant manager approached Grace carrying a reservation list. One of the evening servers had suddenly become ill, leaving the restaurant short-handed. Grace listened carefully before smiling. "I can stay longer if the team needs help," she replied without hesitation. "Everyone has difficult days." The manager thanked her with obvious relief. Nicholas happened to overhear the brief exchange. There was no complaint in her voice, no negotiation, and no expectation of recognition. She simply chose to help because someone needed help. Lucas quietly smiled. "She seems nice." Nicholas answered honestly. She seems much more than nice. A few minutes later, Grace returned to clear the finished plates. Nicholas looked toward her with genuine respect rather than quiet skepticism. "May I ask you something?" he said in English. Grace nodded politely. "Of course, sir." Nicholas hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Where did you learn Italian?" Grace paused briefly, carefully stacking the empty dishes before answering. "From someone who believed every language is another way to understand people." Her voice remained soft. "It became important to me many years ago." Nicholas sensed there was a much longer story hidden behind those few words, yet her expression gently suggested that she preferred not to discuss it further. He respected the boundary immediately. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. Grace offered a warm smile. "You are very welcome." She gathered the final plate and quietly walked away. Lucas looked at his father with bright curiosity. She did not really answer the question. Nicholas smiled for the first time that afternoon. "No." She answered exactly as much as she wished to share. As they prepared to leave, Nicholas placed the payment folder on the table. Before standing, he glanced one last time across the elegant dining room where Grace was helping another guest with the same patience and quiet dignity. Something about the afternoon refused to leave his thoughts. It was not simply the flawless Italian. It was the calm confidence of someone who never felt the need to impress anyone. Walking toward the entrance beside his son, Nicholas realized he had entered the restaurant believing knowledge was something people displayed to gain admiration. Grace had quietly shown him something entirely different. True wisdom often reveals itself only after humility learns how to listen. The afternoon slowly settled into a quieter rhythm after the lunch crowd began to leave, but Bellefonte remained filled with the gentle sounds of conversation, polished dishes, and soft piano music drifting through the elegant dining room. Grace Bennett continued serving guests with the same quiet dedication that had shaped every hour of her work. The conversation with Nicholas Romano had already faded into the background of her thoughts because she believed every customer deserved the same attention, whether they remembered her tomorrow or not. She carefully carried a tray of fresh espresso toward a table near the center of the restaurant, where 3 international business executives had gathered for a private meeting. Their discussion moved naturally between English and Italian as they reviewed documents spread neatly. Across the table, Grace placed each cup with steady hands before quietly stepping away without interrupting their conversation. Moments later, one executive frowned while studying a printed contract. "This translation does not match the original Italian clause," he said with visible concern. "If this wording is correct, the delivery schedule changes by nearly 3 weeks. Another executive compared the English and Italian versions before shaking his head. "Something is wrong, but I cannot identify where the translation failed." The restaurant manager happened to overhear their concern while walking past the table. Hoping to be helpful, he apologized for the interruption and suggested that they contact a professional translator later that afternoon. Grace was arranging clean glasses nearby when the discussion reached her ears. She remained focused on her work until one executive politely turned toward the manager. "Do you know anyone who understands both business English and Italian well enough to explain this sentence?" Before the manager could answer, Grace quietly stepped forward with respectful hesitation. "If you would like," she said gently, "I can read the paragraph for you. I may be able to identify the difference." The executives exchanged uncertain glances before handing her the document. Grace read only a few lines before smiling politely. "The English translation is technically correct," she explained calmly, "but one legal expression carries a different business meaning in Italian. The original sentence refers to shipment authorization rather than shipment completion. That changes the timeline completely." She pointed toward a single phrase before continuing. "If this wording remains unchanged, both sides may believe they agreed to different deadlines." The executives carefully reread the paragraph before one of them slowly smiled with obvious relief. "She is absolutely right." Another nodded immediately. "That explains the entire disagreement." They thanked Grace sincerely before returning to their meeting with renewed confidence. She simply wished them success and quietly resumed polishing wine glasses as though nothing unusual had occurred. Nicholas and Lucas had remained near the entrance while waiting for their car, because traffic outside Fifth Avenue had slowed unexpectedly. From a distance, Nicholas had witnessed the entire exchange without hearing every word, yet he recognized the expressions on the executives' faces. Confusion had become understanding within only a few calm sentences. Lucas looked toward his father. She helped them too. Nicholas nodded thoughtfully. And once again, she never tried to impress anyone. As they finally stepped outside into the cool Manhattan afternoon, Nicholas found himself thinking less about Grace's remarkable Italian and more about the extraordinary judgment she displayed while using it. Knowledge alone could explain vocabulary. Character explained why she chose to use that knowledge only when it truly helped someone else. For the first time in many years, Nicholas wondered whether the most valuable people in the world were not always sitting inside executive offices. Sometimes they quietly carried serving trays, wore simple black aprons, and changed important moments without asking anyone to notice. The following Tuesday morning, Grace Bennett arrived at Bellafont before sunrise, just as she always did. The quiet restaurant still rested beneath dim lights while the first rays of autumn sunlight slowly brightened the Manhattan skyline outside the tall windows. She tied her black apron neatly, prepared fresh coffee for the kitchen staff, arranged flowers on every table, and carefully reviewed the day's reservations before the doors opened. Routine never felt ordinary to Grace. Every small task deserved the same attention because she believed excellence was built through habits that few people noticed. Later that morning, while polishing crystal glasses near the service station, she overheard the restaurant owner speaking anxiously on the phone inside the office. A translator scheduled for an important private business luncheon had canceled unexpectedly because of a family emergency. Several international investors from Italy were expected to arrive within an hour, and the restaurant had promised language assistance for their meeting. The owner quietly sighed after ending the call, unsure how to solve the problem without disappointing long-standing clients. Grace gently knocked on the office door. "Excuse me," she said politely. "If it would be helpful, I can assist with basic interpretation during lunch until you find a replacement." The owner looked surprised. "You speak Italian well enough for business discussions?" Grace smiled modestly. "Only if they need simple clarification. Their legal advisors should still handle formal agreements." The owner hesitated for only a moment before gratefully accepting her offer. Shortly before noon, the guests arrived exactly as scheduled. Grace welcomed each visitor warmly, guided them to their private dining room, and quietly assisted whenever a brief explanation became necessary. She never interrupted conversations or inserted personal opinions. She translated only what was needed, then immediately returned to serving meals with the same professionalism she showed every customer. The meeting proceeded smoothly, and before leaving, one elderly Italian investor warmly thanked the restaurant owner. "Your young waitress speaks with remarkable precision," he said. "More importantly, she understands when silence is more valuable than unnecessary words." Grace lowered her eyes with a humble smile, thanked him sincerely, and returned to clearing the table. Later that afternoon, after the final guests departed, the grateful owner handed Grace a sealed envelope containing additional compensation for saving the luncheon. She respectfully declined. "Please share it with the kitchen staff," she said softly. "Everyone worked together today." The owner insisted, but Grace gently shook her head once more. "I was only doing what the situation required." Across the city, Nicholas Romano reviewed documents inside his executive office while Lucas completed homework nearby after school. One of Nicholas's senior vice presidents entered carrying notes from the same investor luncheon. "Interesting coincidence," the executive remarked. The clients praised a waitress at Bellafont for resolving several language misunderstandings with extraordinary professionalism. Apparently, she refused extra payment afterward. Nicholas slowly looked up from the report. "Bellafont," the executive nodded. "Yes, they specifically mentioned a young woman named Grace Bennett." Nicholas remained quiet after the executive left. He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan and reflected on everything that had happened during the past week. Grace had never mentioned her abilities, never sought recognition, and never accepted praise that belonged to the entire team. Every new detail revealed another layer of quiet character hidden beneath the same simple black apron. Nicholas reached for his notebook and wrote only one sentence before closing it again. "Some people deserve opportunities because of what they achieve when nobody is watching." At that moment, he had not yet decided exactly what he would do, but one conviction had already become impossible to ignore. If Grace Bennett possessed the same integrity in every part of her life that she displayed inside that restaurant, then the world had almost certainly underestimated her for far too long. 3 days later, Nicholas Romano announced a new initiative inside Romano Global Logistics. Rather than recruiting only through prestigious universities or executive search firms, the company would launch an anonymous talent evaluation open to qualified applicants from every professional background. Names, occupations, employers, and personal histories would remain hidden throughout the assessment. Only knowledge, judgment, communication, and ethical decision-making would determine the outcome. Several executives questioned the unusual approach during the leadership meeting. Nicholas listened patiently before answering. Talent does not ask permission before it appears. Sometimes we simply fail to recognize it. Across the city, Grace Bennett knew nothing about the discussion taking place inside the headquarters. She arrived at Bellafont as usual, tied her black apron, greeted every coworker warmly, and began preparing for another busy lunch service. During her afternoon break, she opened a public career website on her phone to review new opportunities related to international business and language analysis. One announcement immediately caught her attention. Romano Global Logistics had opened applications for a financial strategy development program unlike any recruitment process she had ever seen. Every candidate would remain anonymous until the final evaluation. Academic ability, ethical reasoning, communication, and strategic thinking would carry equal weight. Grace quietly read every requirement twice before closing the screen. She did not apply immediately. Instead, she spent the next several evenings carefully reviewing financial case studies, international trade regulations, and analytical exercises she had collected over many years. She had never stopped learning, even during long restaurant shifts. Books filled the shelves of her small apartment. Handwritten notes covered topics ranging from economics and logistics to Italian commercial law and cross-cultural communication. Learning had never been a hobby. It had become part of who she was. One evening, after finishing another shift, Grace finally completed the application using only the anonymous candidate number assigned by the system. She never mentioned Bellafont, never identified herself as a waitress, and never referred to meeting Nicholas. If she succeeded, she wanted every result to belong entirely to her own preparation. The following week, hundreds of applicants gathered at a modern testing center in Midtown Manhattan. Every participant wore the same identification badge, displaying only a number. Grace quietly took her assigned seat near the back of the examination room. Around her sat recent graduates, experienced analysts, military veterans, engineers, accountants, and professionals from many different industries. No one knew anyone else's background. For the first time in years, Grace felt completely equal to everyone around her. Inside Romano Global Headquarters, Nicholas reviewed the first stage of the assessment with the Human Resources Director. "Have candidate identities been completely removed?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Even the evaluation committee cannot see names until the final decision." Nicholas nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Then let ability speak for itself." Hours later, the first examination concluded. It challenged far more than technical knowledge. Candidates faced realistic business scenarios requiring careful judgment, ethical reasoning, financial analysis, and clear communication under time pressure. Grace worked steadily without rushing, carefully reading every question before writing each response. She finished only minutes before time expired, reviewed every page once more, and quietly submitted her materials without any expectation beyond doing her best. As she stepped outside into the cool Manhattan evening, she looked up at the fading sunlight reflecting across the city skyline and smiled softly. Whatever happened next no longer depended upon appearances, uniforms, or assumptions. For the first time since beginning her working life, every door ahead would open or remain closed for only one reason: the quality of her mind. 1 week after the first examination, anonymous emails arrived simultaneously in inboxes across the country. Grace Bennett quietly opened hers during a short break behind the restaurant kitchen. She had advanced to the second evaluation. She smiled gently, folded the printed invitation, and carefully placed it inside the same notebook where she kept years of handwritten lessons, vocabulary lists, financial formulas, and personal reflections. Then she returned to the dining room, tied her black apron once again, and welcomed arriving customers as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Opportunity had never given her permission to stop doing ordinary work with extraordinary care. The second assessment took place inside Romano Global Logistics headquarters overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Every candidate still carried only an identification number. No names appeared on doors, computer screens, or evaluation documents. Grace quietly entered the modern conference center wearing a simple navy business suit instead of her restaurant uniform. Around her stood experienced consultants, financial analysts, business owners, and graduates from prestigious universities. No one knew that candidate 1847 had spent the previous evening serving pasta, refilling coffee cups, and helping close a restaurant after midnight. The evaluators explained the challenge. Each participant would receive a complex international logistics crisis involving supply chain delays, cultural misunderstandings, financial risk, and ethical responsibility. Every solution had to balance profitability with long-term trust. Grace carefully studied every page before writing her first note. She ignored the ticking clock and focused instead on understanding the people hidden behind the numbers. Rather than recommending immediate contract penalties, she proposed rebuilding communication between suppliers, correcting translation errors before assigning blame, protecting smaller partners from unnecessary financial damage, and redesigning the shipping process to prevent similar problems in the future. Every recommendation included measurable financial outcomes and realistic implementation timelines. When the oral presentation began, several evaluators intentionally challenged her conclusions. One questioned whether her approach protected relationships at the expense of profit. Another argued that aggressive legal action would create faster financial recovery. Grace listened completely before answering. She thanked each evaluator for the question, acknowledged the strengths of every opposing argument, and calmly explained why sustainable international business depended upon credibility as much as quarterly earnings. She never interrupted anyone. She never raised her voice. Her confidence came from careful reasoning rather than personal pride. Behind a one-way observation window, Nicholas Romano quietly reviewed presentations alongside senior executives. Candidate identities remained hidden exactly as promised. He knew nothing about the person standing inside the presentation room beyond the number displayed on the evaluation file. Yet candidate 1847 immediately captured his attention. The calm posture, the thoughtful pauses before every answer, the quiet habit of listening before speaking. Something about the candidate's presence felt strangely familiar, although he could not explain why. After the presentation ended, one evaluator looked toward the observation room and smiled. Candidate 1847 demonstrates exceptional strategic judgment, she remarked. Another executive nodded. Strong analytical ability, excellent communication, and unusual emotional intelligence. Nicholas remained silent while reading the written evaluation summary. The scores ranked among the highest of the entire assessment. Later that evening, Grace changed back into her black apron and returned to Bellafont for the dinner shift. Customers filled the restaurant once again, unaware that the quiet waitress serving their meals had just completed one of the most demanding business evaluations in the city. She greeted every table with the same gentle smile she always carried, never mentioning the examination and never imagining that somewhere across Manhattan, an anonymous evaluation committee had already begun discussing the remarkable candidate whose wisdom seemed impossible to overlook, even without knowing the name behind the number. Another week passed before the final group of anonymous candidates received invitations to the third stage of the evaluation. Grace Bennett quietly read the email after finishing the breakfast preparation at Bellafont. She folded the printed invitation, slipped it into her notebook, and continued arranging fresh flowers on every table before the first guests arrived. Nothing in her routine changed because she believed consistency revealed character far more honestly than celebration ever could. Across Manhattan, Romano Global Logistics prepared for the most demanding assessment yet. Only 12 anonymous candidates remained from hundreds of original applicants. Their identities remained completely hidden behind numerical identification. Nicholas Romano reviewed the evaluation schedule alongside the executive committee. The final challenge would no longer measure technical knowledge alone. Every remaining participant had already demonstrated exceptional analytical ability. Now the company wanted to discover who possessed judgment, integrity, emotional intelligence, and the courage to defend difficult decisions under thoughtful examination. Challenge every recommendation fairly. Nicholas reminded the committee. Do not reward confidence alone. Reward wisdom. On the morning of the assessment, Grace entered the headquarters wearing the same simple navy business suit she had worn during the previous evaluation. Candidate 1847 appeared on the badge clipped neatly to her jacket. Nothing else identified her. She quietly greeted the receptionist, accepted the sealed case study, and entered a private conference room overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The business scenario described a multinational partnership threatened by costly delays, conflicting legal translations, and declining trust between international suppliers. Rather than searching immediately for financial shortcuts, Grace carefully studied every page twice before writing a single note. She recognized something familiar within the case. Several misunderstandings originated not from dishonesty, but from cultural assumptions and inaccurate language interpretation. During the presentation, Grace calmly explained that sustainable leadership required solving the cause of conflict instead of merely calculating the cost of its consequences. She proposed establishing multilingual review teams before contract approval, investing in stronger communication between regional offices, improving transparency throughout the supply chain, and measuring long-term client confidence alongside financial performance. One evaluator questioned whether those recommendations required too much patience. Grace smiled gently before answering. Trust takes longer to build than revenue, but once trust disappears, recovering revenue becomes much more expensive. Another executive challenged her financial projections. Grace carefully acknowledged the concern before adjusting one assumption and demonstrating that even under more conservative estimates, her strategy protected both profitability and long-term relationships. She never argued. She reasoned. Behind the observation glass, Nicholas remained unusually quiet. Candidate 1847 displayed the same calm confidence he remembered from somewhere beyond the walls of the company. The thoughtful pauses before answering. The respectful tone toward every question. The habit of placing people and principles alongside financial outcomes. Each detail felt strangely familiar, although the candidate's identity remained hidden. When the presentation concluded, the committee reviewed the anonymous scoring sheets. One senior executive looked toward Nicholas with genuine admiration. Candidate 1847 continues to rank first in every category. Another added, excellent financial judgment, exceptional communication, and uncommon maturity under pressure. Nicholas slowly closed the evaluation folder without speaking. Later that evening, after changing back into her black apron, Grace returned to Bellefont for another dinner service. She welcomed families celebrating birthdays, travelers visiting New York for the first time, and elderly couples enjoying quiet conversations over Italian meals. No customer realized that the waitress serving their dinner had just become the highest-ranked anonymous candidate inside one of the city's most respected companies. Across town, Nicholas stood alone inside his office overlooking the lights of Manhattan, quietly studying the anonymous evaluation summaries once again. He still did not know who candidate 1847 was, yet one thought returned more strongly with every passing day. Somewhere in the city, an extraordinary mind had quietly earned remarkable respect without ever asking anyone to notice. The final stage of the anonymous evaluation arrived beneath a clear Manhattan sky, filled with crisp autumn sunlight. Grace Bennett finished arranging fresh flowers at Bellefont before sunrise, thanked the kitchen staff, carefully folded her black apron into her canvas bag, and changed into her simple navy business suit. She quietly wished her coworkers a pleasant day before taking the subway toward Romano Global Logistics headquarters. The final assessment would determine only one successful candidate, yet Grace carried no expectation beyond doing her very best. She had already gained something far more valuable than confidence. She had proven to herself that years of quiet preparation had never been wasted. Inside the executive conference center, the remaining 12 candidates gathered in respectful silence. Their badges displayed only anonymous numbers. Candidate 1847 quietly accepted a sealed folder before entering a modern boardroom where the final challenge awaited. Each participant would analyze a complex international expansion proposal involving American and Italian partners, conflicting cultural expectations, multilingual negotiations, financial forecasting, and long-term strategic planning. The case demanded not only business knowledge, but genuine understanding of how language could influence trust between people from different cultures. Grace carefully reviewed every document twice before writing her first observation. She noticed that several projected risks did not originate from financial weakness, but from subtle differences in communication and interpretation between the American and Italian negotiating teams. During the presentation, Grace calmly explained that successful international leadership required respecting cultural perspectives as seriously as financial projections. She proposed creating bilingual negotiation teams, strengthening cross-cultural executive training, simplifying contractual language without changing legal precision, and establishing transparent communication channels before major agreements were signed. One evaluator interrupted with a difficult question. Suppose the Italian partners refuse those recommendations because they believe tradition should remain unchanged. How would you respond? Grace smiled gently before answering. I would begin by listening before proposing change. People rarely reject respect. They usually reject the feeling of being misunderstood. Another executive challenged her financial assumptions. Your proposal requires additional investment. Why should shareholders accept slower short-term returns? Grace acknowledged the concern with quiet confidence. Because trust creates measurable financial value. Partnerships built upon mutual understanding reduce future legal disputes, strengthen customer confidence, improve operational efficiency, and ultimately produce stronger long-term returns than agreements built only upon speed. The room became unusually quiet. Her answers never sounded rehearsed. They reflected experience, observation, and genuine wisdom. Behind the observation glass, Nicholas Romano watched candidate 1847 with growing admiration. Something about the candidate's thoughtful pauses, respectful tone, and balanced judgment felt increasingly familiar. He still could not explain why, but every answer reminded him of someone he had met before. After the presentation concluded, the executive committee carefully reviewed the anonymous scorecards. One evaluator spoke first. Candidate 1847 once again receives the highest evaluation in analytical reasoning. Another added, the strongest communication skills of the entire competition. A third executive smiled thoughtfully. More importantly, every recommendation demonstrates unusual humility without sacrificing leadership. Nicholas quietly studied the evaluation summary before closing the folder. No one had yet opened the confidential identity records. The committee still knew nothing beyond a candidate number. Later that evening, Grace returned to Bellefonte wearing her familiar black apron, greeting every guest with the same warm smile that had welcomed countless customers before. She served coffee, recommended desserts, and patiently answered questions exactly as she had done long before Romano Global entered her life. Across the city, Nicholas remained alone inside his office reviewing the final anonymous rankings. Candidate 1847 stood clearly above every other applicant. Tomorrow the identities would finally be revealed. Tonight, however, one remarkable truth had already become impossible to deny. Somewhere beyond the executive offices and polished conference rooms, extraordinary excellence had quietly earned its place without asking anyone to believe in it first. The following afternoon, the executive conference room at Romano Global Logistics remained unusually quiet as the leadership team gathered around a polished walnut table overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Weeks of anonymous evaluations had finally reached their conclusion. Every written assessment had been graded. Every presentation had been reviewed. Every discussion had been completed without revealing a single candidate's identity. Nicholas Romano slowly looked around the room. Before speaking, before we open the identity files, I want to thank every member of this committee for protecting the integrity of this process. Today we will discover whether our decisions were truly guided by merit alone. The Human Resources Director nodded before placing a sealed envelope beside the projector. All final rankings have been verified, she said calmly. No identities have been viewed by anyone. Nicholas took a slow breath. Then let us begin. The first screen displayed only numbers. Candidate 1847 stood clearly at the top with the highest combined score in strategic analysis, ethical leadership, communication, financial reasoning, and cross-cultural decision-making. One executive smiled with admiration. This candidate has produced one of the strongest evaluation records we have ever seen." Another nodded. "The remarkable part is the consistency. Every stage showed the same judgment, humility, and professionalism." Nicholas quietly agreed. "Open the identity file." The room became completely silent as the human resources director entered the secure authorization code. The anonymous number disappeared. A professional photograph slowly appeared on the large presentation screen. Grace Bennett. Current occupation, waitress at Bellafont Italian restaurant. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Nicholas remained perfectly still while recognition slowly settled across his face. The quiet waitress who had whispered flawless Italian. The young woman who had calmly corrected an international translation. The employee who had refused extra compensation after helping strangers. The same person had quietly become candidate 1847 without mentioning their previous meetings or asking for a single advantage. One executive broke the silence. She never disclosed her background during the application. The human resources director nodded. Not once. Her application contained only verified qualifications and anonymous examination results. She followed every rule exactly as instructed. Nicholas slowly walked toward the windows overlooking the city. "She understood the process better than anyone," he said softly. "If she had identified herself, people might have questioned whether she received special treatment. Instead, she allowed her work to speak before her name." The committee reviewed the remainder of Grace's confidential file. Years earlier, she had completed advanced university coursework before unexpected family responsibilities forced her to leave school and begin working full-time. Rather than abandoning her education, she had continued studying independently through professional certification programs, public libraries, online university courses, and countless evenings after long restaurant shifts. Shelves of handwritten notebooks documented years of disciplined learning in economics, international trade, finance, languages, and leadership. One executive quietly lowered the file. Most people would have spoken about these accomplishments immediately. Nicholas smiled thoughtfully. Grace never needed recognition to continue improving. At that same moment, Grace stood inside Bellafont wearing her familiar black apron, carefully serving lunch to a family celebrating their grandparents' anniversary. She laughed gently with a young child choosing dessert, thanked every guest sincerely, and quietly helped a new co-worker learn the reservation system without mentioning the life-changing decision taking place several miles away. She believed the final results would arrive when they were ready. Across Manhattan, Nicholas looked once more at Grace's photograph displayed on the conference room screen. The lesson became unmistakably clear. The woman he had once believed to be an ordinary waitress had never hidden her intelligence. The world had simply been too distracted by her apron to notice everything else she carried with quiet dignity every single day. 2 days later, Grace Bennett received a simple email inviting her to Romano Global Logistics headquarters for the official announcement of the anonymous selection process. The message revealed nothing beyond the time and location. Grace quietly folded the printed invitation and placed it inside the same notebook that had accompanied her through years of study, long restaurant shifts, and countless evenings of independent learning. On the morning of the announcement, she arrived at Bellafont before sunrise to help prepare the dining room one final time before requesting a few hours away from work. She tied her black apron, brewed fresh coffee for the kitchen staff, arranged white roses on every table, and thanked each coworker for covering her afternoon shift. Only after every task had been completed did she change into her simple navy business suit and leave for Midtown Manhattan. Inside the executive conference room, the remaining finalists quietly took their seats. Every candidate now knew that the anonymous process had ended, but none knew the final rankings. Nicholas Romano stood beside the executive committee with calm composure. Lucas sat quietly in the back of the room after school had granted permission for him to attend the announcement. Nicholas welcomed every finalist before speaking. "Each of you proved that ability deserves opportunity regardless of background. This process reminded our company that excellence often appears where few people expect to find it." The human resources director began announcing several finalists who would receive future opportunities within the company. Warm applause followed every name. Grace sincerely applauded each successful candidate without wondering whether her own name would be called. She had already decided that honest effort remained valuable regardless of the outcome. Finally, the director paused before opening the final folder. The highest overall evaluation and the position of International Strategy Analyst are awarded to Grace Bennett. For a brief moment, Grace remained perfectly still. Then she slowly stood as respectful applause filled the conference room. She walked calmly toward the front without excitement or disbelief, carrying herself with the same quiet dignity she had shown every day inside Bellafont. Nicholas extended his hand. Grace accepted it with a gentle smile. Before presenting the official appointment, Nicholas turned toward the audience. "There is something I need to say." The room became completely silent. Nicholas looked briefly toward Grace before continuing. "The first time I met Grace, I believed I was evaluating someone else's knowledge. The truth is that I was revealing the limits of my own judgment. I saw a black apron before I saw the person wearing it. That was my mistake." Several executives quietly lowered their eyes. Nicholas continued with sincere honesty. "Grace never corrected me to protect her pride. She never mentioned our previous meetings during the recruitment process. She chose to let discipline, preparation, integrity, and character speak before her name ever appeared on a screen. Today, our company is not giving her an opportunity. We are recognizing one she has already earned." Grace accepted the appointment letter before speaking softly. "Thank you. Respect grows strongest when it is shared freely rather than demanded. Every person deserves to be seen for more than the work they happen to be doing today." Lucas smiled proudly as he watched both adults standing together. He realized that the quiet Italian conversation inside the restaurant weeks earlier had never truly been about language. It had always been about listening without assumptions. As warm applause filled the room once again, Nicholas understood that the greatest lesson his son would remember from that season would not involve business, wealth, or success. It would be the simple truth that genuine wisdom often speaks softly, waits patiently, and never needs to announce its own worth. Several months quietly passed, and life settled into a rhythm that looked different on the surface but remained unchanged where it mattered most. Every morning, Grace Bennett entered the headquarters of Romano Global Logistics carrying the same canvas bag she had once brought to Bellafont. Folded neatly inside remained her black waitress apron. She never displayed it to anyone, yet she never considered leaving it behind. It reminded her that dignity had never been created by a job title. It had always been revealed through the way she treated people long before anyone knew her name. As an international strategy analyst, Grace quickly earned the respect of colleagues across every department. She listened before speaking, welcomed questions from new employees, and encouraged experienced executives to challenge ideas rather than defend personal opinions. Meetings became calmer, discussions became more thoughtful, and decisions increasingly reflected long-term trust instead of short-term pride. Nicholas Romano quietly noticed the difference. More importantly, Lucas noticed it as well. One afternoon after school, Lucas visited the headquarters and found Grace reviewing bilingual documents inside a conference room overlooking the Manhattan skyline. He smiled as he remembered the first afternoon they had met inside Bellafont. "I have been studying Italian," he admitted with quiet excitement. Grace smiled warmly. "How is it going?" Lucas laughed softly. "I finally understand that learning a language is really about understanding people." Grace nodded. "That is exactly why every language matters." Nicholas listened from the doorway without interrupting. He realized his son had learned something far more valuable than grammar or vocabulary. Several weeks later, Bellafont celebrated its anniversary with a special evening for longtime employees and loyal guests. Grace accepted the invitation without hesitation. After finishing work at Romano Global, she changed into simple clothes, arrived at the restaurant carrying fresh flowers for the staff, and quietly asked the manager whether she could help during the busiest dinner hour. The manager smiled with genuine affection before handing her the familiar black apron she had once worn every day. Grace tied it around her waist with the same quiet gratitude she had always carried. She greeted customers, served meals, refilled coffee cups, and laughed warmly with former coworkers exactly as though nothing had changed. Near sunset, the front door opened once again. Nicholas entered beside Lucas, this time without hurried phone calls or pressing business concerns. They requested the same table near the windows where everything had begun months earlier. Grace welcomed them with the same gentle smile that had greeted them on their first visit. Lucas smiled immediately. "It is good to see you again." Grace thanked them sincerely before placing menus on the table. Nicholas looked around the elegant dining room before meeting her eyes. In quiet, fluent Italian, he said, "Thank you for teaching me that the most important conversations begin only after we stop making assumptions." Grace smiled softly before answering in equally natural Italian. "The best lessons belong to everyone willing to listen." Neither of them spoke another word in Italian that evening because nothing more needed to be said. As father and son finished dinner, Nicholas looked toward Lucas and saw not only a happier child but a kinder one. They quietly thanked Grace before leaving the restaurant together. Outside, the lights of Manhattan reflected across the sidewalks exactly as they had on the afternoon their lives first crossed. Inside Bellafont, Grace removed the black apron, folded it carefully, and placed it back inside her canvas bag before helping her coworkers close the restaurant one final time. Some people believe extraordinary lives begin with extraordinary opportunities. Grace had quietly proven something much more enduring. Extraordinary lives often begin the moment someone chooses humility over pride, understanding over assumption, and quiet excellence over the need to be seen.